All those who served Hitler's Germany now stand before the nations of the world, accused of turning war into an instrument of mass extermination of civilians, violence, and banditry. The Court Nuremberg coming to cinemas on March 2nd. Friends, hello. Exactly 77 years ago, in these very days, the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg reached its climax. The Nuremberg Trials, the major trial of the 20th century, the trial of war criminals. Recently, a film titled Nuremberg was released, directed by Nikolai Lebedev, about the Nuremberg process. It also happens to be the final work of the renowned composer Eduard Artemiev. The film, understandably, follows the story of the chief prosecutor from the Soviet side, Rudenko. And come on, you can guess? Who plays him? Of course, Bezrukov. You could hardly cast anyone else. It's clear that in these days, there'll be a lot of talk about Nuremberg. Every year, as May 9th approaches, the trial re-enters the media. New versions appear. Certain facts are unearthed anew. We decided to get ahead of that cycle and make this episode now. From the vantage point of 2023, it might seem that the Nuremberg trials are straightforward. The fascists, the Nazis, annihilated people everybody knew, so they were condemned. But if we rewind the tape, here is the detail that struck me the most about the trial. The full scope of the atrocities, the horrors that had been set upon rails, organized to function like a well-tuned German automobile, like a conveyor belt, was barely known to the general public until journalists entered the concentration camps, liberated by the Red Army and by the Allies. Only then did the world start to grasp it. What unfolded in the courtroom did more than shock. People literally lost the power of speech. Before or since, Europe had never seen horrors like these. Let's go step by step. Where did the trial come from? Why the Nuremberg trials arose in 1943, when it became more or less clear that the coalition of the Allies, the Americans, the British, and the Soviet Union would defeat Nazi Germany. A question emerged. What to do with the war criminals? By then, in the Soviet Union above all, there was a vast trove of documented crimes-burned villages, protocols from camps, torture and abuse, the plunder of the country, and the removal of museum collections. The same had happened in France, in Poland. This much was known. On October 30th, 1943, the Allies signed the Moscow Declaration, stating for the first time that the parties intended to punish war criminals. And then come the surprising facts. I am not misspeaking. I myself, frankly, didn't know this before. The Allies viewed the upcoming process differently. Everyone demanded punishment, of course, but hardly anyone demanded a court in the beginning. The Americans proposed selecting a number of war criminals and executing them without trial or investigation by hanging. Churchill opposed hanging as inhumane. He suggested shooting instead. He even sent Stalin extensive lists of Nazi criminals to be shot outright. The idea was, no court is needed. We know enough already. Moreover, Churchill argued the process should be political, not juridical, to signal to the world that an aggressor would be punished, that we will get them all. There's another detail. At this time, President Roosevelt argued that Germans should not be divided into good Germans and bad Germans, and that the entire population of Germany bore responsibility for what had happened. Thus, the thesis of collective guilt appeared. On those lists, tens of thousands of people, potentially up to 50,000 were. Leaders at top, middle, and lesser levels of the Nazi system, SS, SA, NSDAP operatives, ministries, and agencies. If you shoot 50,000 people without trial, well, that was the initial logic. In the end, by 1944, the Allies agreed that there would be a trial. Another reason some Allies hesitated to have an open court. During an open process, testimony would be given under oath. The Munich Agreement, in which the Allies handed over Czechoslovakia, would surface. evidence that Third Reich industry had been financed and technologically supported by American corporations would surface. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, concluded before the war between the USSR and Hitler, would surface. All of this made the Allies wary, but the idea that it would be an open legal proceeding eventually prevailed, and the sides agreed on the Nuremberg Trials. A brief aside, it really was the first trial of its kind, where a coalition of countries publicly tried war criminals. There had been an attempt after the First World War, when Germany had devastated large swaths of France's cultural heritage and poison gas had been used. The Allies tried to set up a court, but handed the matter to the Germans themselves, who summoned about 900 officers. 90% failed to show. Others escaped. The matter was buried. You can imagine, Germans judging Germans. Nothing came of it. So, Nuremberg truly was a precedent. What the defendants were charged with. On November 20th, 1945, the trial began in Nuremberg, the International Military Tribunal. 4 main counts of indictment: conspiracy to seize power in Germany, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The process targeted not only individuals, but also organizations: the NSDAP, Nazi Party, the SS, the Gestapo, the Wehrmacht, the Reichsbank, and the German government. In short, everyone who made decisions to exterminate people and gave criminal orders. 4 countries were the organizers: the USSR, the USA, Great Britain, and France. The inclusion of France was met with some skepticism in the press. There's a famous historical anecdote. When Field Marshal Keitel signed Germany's capitulation, 4 countries received it. Seeing the French delegation, he tugged off his glove and muttered, "You too have defeated us." France had been occupied. That was bad enough. But there had also been collaboration. The Vichy government had cooperated with Hitler. Still, France's presence gave the tribunal the dimension of a victim among the Western Allies. Yugoslavia had initially been considered, but Western allies opposed it. Communism was ascendant there, and the country was drifting toward the Soviet camp, so the French, widely admired thanks to de Gaulle, took the seat. The French prosecutorial team largely comprised members of the resistance. The tribunal was constituted as follows: presiding judge, the Briton Geoffrey Lawrence; chief prosecutors, Robert Jackson, USA; Hartley Shawcross, UK; Roman Rudenko, USSR; and François de Menthon, France. Judges: Francis Biddle, Henri Donadieu de Vabre, Iona Nikitchenko, and Geoffrey Lawrence. Once the bench and prosecution were set, the accused were granted the right to counsel. Here a nuance. The defendants began rejecting counsel provided by the Allies. Göring was first. "How can your lawyers defend us while you judge us? The process will be biased." They then sought German attorneys. German lawyers balked, who would want to be known forever as Göring's defense counsel. That would mark a career for decades. The court had to guarantee that no reprisals would follow, and that their careers would not be harmed for serving as defense only. Then did German lawyers step up. The accused, via family and acquaintances, found counsel. Who took the dock? Criminal number 1 Hitler evaded justice by taking his own life before capitulation. Himmler, head of the RSHA, the architect of the SS, and much else. The man responsible for the Holocaust and for countless crimes also took poison. Goebbels and his wife killed themselves and their children. Martin Bormann, effectively number 2 in the party, vanished. Gestapo chief Heinrich Müller disappeared. Later, I'll say what became of them. Müller was never found. Bormann's remains would be identified much later. Many Nazis escaped via rat lines to Franco's Spain, Salazar's Portugal, or to Argentina like Dr. Mengele, whom agents would catch decades later. Many thus evaded justice. Still, a formidable group sat in the dock. By seniority, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring Weissführer, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, the biggest catch to fall into the hands of justice. Rudolf Hess' complex story, but he had been Hitler's deputy in the party and was for years very close to him. During the war, he ended up in British captivity. Joachim von Ribbentrop Reich Foreign Minister, responsible for foreign policy. Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of OKW, High Command of the Wehrmacht. Alfred Rosenberg, the party's ideologue, in many ways a madman, but influential. Hans Frank, Chief Jurist of the Third Reich, the party's Reichsleiter for legal affairs. He had drafted the laws that underpinned the Holocaust, the camp system, sham trials, expropriations. Julius Streicher, the craziest of them all, publisher of Der Stürmer, the primary anti-Semitic rag of Nazi Germany. I'll return to him. Walter Funk, plenipotentiary for war economy, responsible for slave labor on German factories, deportations, and economic plunder. Karl Dönitz, Grand Admiral, who commanded Germany's navy. Erich Raeder, commander of the U-boat fleet. Baldur von Schirach Reich, youth leader, architect of the Hitler Youth. Fritz Sauckel, plenipotentiary for labor deployment, directly responsible for slave labor of POWs and civilians deported to Germany. Alfred Jodl, chief of operations of the Wehrmacht. Franz von Papen, diplomat, who helped bring Hitler to power. He would later be acquitted. Arthur Seyss Inquart Key, figure in the Anschluss of Austria and the camp network in Austria and the Netherlands. Albert Speer, known to many as the Reich's chief architect, but beyond stadia and grand plans, he oversaw war industry that used slave labor. Konstantin von Neurath, foreign minister before Ribbentrop. And finally, Hans Fritzsche, the voice of Nazi Germany, the radio propagandist. Hello, this is Hans Fritzsche. Twice a week, he told citizens how valiant German troops fought, urged harsher solutions to the Jewish question. Radio was then what television later became, and Goebbels recognized it as the supreme medium. Fritzsche was his favorite barker. Many doubted the process. Could the Allies coordinate? How would the trial be run? Most importantly, what evidence would they bring? Here I want to salute my colleagues in spirit, archivists. Tons, literally, of documents were located and used. Ironically, we owe this to German pedantry. Every victim, every execution, every operation diligently documented, neatly filed, dispatched through ministries. 10,000 shot in Ukraine. A report would be written, numbered, forwarded. The most chilling, Einsatzgruppen reports to Himmler in Berlin, complaining of workload. We are executing 3,000 people per day. The men are exhausted. They're burning out on the job. Could we improve procedure? For instance, we propose digging a trench. One column is shot and falls into the trench, then the next column on top of them, and then the next. This would facilitate burial and reduce effort. This proposal goes to the RSHJ. Approved, writes Himmler. Off they go. Such documents abounded. Manuals existed for Gaswagen mobile gas chambers, which gas to use, Zyklon B, how to avoid clogging pipes, etc., all neatly detailed. Many documents were hidden down mine shafts or sunk in lakes, but massive caches were captured and reached the court. Robert Jackson, the American chief prosecutor, began his opening address with, "Our proof will be horrifying, and you will say I have robbed you of your sleep. But it was these acts that shook the world and brought every civilized person to stand against Nazi Germany." Germany became one vast torture chamber. The cries of her victims echoed around the world. I am one of those who listened with skepticism to tales of atrocities during the war, but the evidence presented here will be so overwhelming that I dare predict not a word I say will be disproved. The defendants will deny only their personal responsibility or their knowledge of the crimes. And indeed, that is how it played out. After the prosecution's films, American and Soviet people fainted in the courtroom. The defendant's refrain became, "We were mere shadow puppets of Hitler. We followed orders. We knew nothing." Only Göring tried to fight the process rhetorically, becoming its dark star early on. The trial opened November 20th, 1945. On the 25th, the first scandal. Robert Ley, head of the German Labor Front, responsible for the entire proletarian machinery, hanged himself. He did not admit guilt. He expressed regret for excesses of anti-Semitism, but remained a Hitler loyalist. By 1945, he was already a ruined man and a drunk. There's an anecdote. Edward II, who abdicated the British throne, paving the way for Elizabeth II, visited Germany and was chauffeured by Ley. Ley got so drunk, he nearly killed the former king in an accident. Known as the Führer of the proletariat, Ley understood he would hang. He chose suicide. The process teetered. Tensions rose between Soviet, American, and British sides as they quarreled over the trial's script, its dramaturgy. On October 15th of 16, the prosecution moved to indict Gustav Krupp, steel magnate, pillar of war industry, but he was too senile. They tried to substitute his son, involved in the firm, but judges disagreed. The elder Krupp remained indicted in name, but did not stand trial. In mid-October, the legendary Soviet cartoonists, Kukrynytsky, arrived to illustrate the proceedings. The press was admitted, vital, given that at first the Americans and British had argued to close the trial to the press. The USSR insisted on an open, adversarial court, and in the end, journalists filled the hall. The balcony admitted spectators' wives of the accused, locals. One might ask, why didn't all Nuremberg gather daily at this courthouse? The truth, Nuremberg and its surroundings were a wasteland. Hunger, no heat, ruins. People scavenged cigarette butts to resell. There was no time for spectating. Moreover, for decades, surveys showed German ambivalence. Hitler was a criminal, but it's not all so clear. We still sympathize with him a little. Göring declared early on, "This is a victor's trial." The Grand Hotel became the social hub after sessions, where prosecutors, journalists, NKVD men, and Allied intelligence officers mingled. British teams lamented the lack of liquor. Lords from London sent crates to support their barristers through the harrowing work. On November 21st, Göring was asked to state simply, guilty or not guilty. Instead, the superb orator began, "If we're speaking of war crimes, what about the bombing of Dresden? What about Hiroshima and Nagasaki?" He began charming the press. The court cut him off. "Answer the question." He pled not guilty and sat. Stryker followed. "This is a tribunal of international jury. I see Jews among judges and prosecutors. I expect no justice." He was sat down. Evidence rolled in. A sensational find in Munich. 9 million NSDAP membership cards, nearly dumped as trash, were saved by chance. Archivists worked under unimaginable strain. 700 people sifting daily through tons of papers, attaching them to cases. Late November, the first acts of aggression. The Anschluss of Austria were examined. Witnesses described the hasty construction of camps. Göring's mocking commentary on Austrians, jockeying for positions in the new order, prompted grim laughter, until November 29th, when the Americans screened their film on the camps. The laughter died. Emaciated piles of corpses, the ovens, the gas chambers, mothers and children who died together. Dachau, Buchenwald, Majdanek. The Soviets announced they were preparing their own film. Swiftly edited it would be shown in February and land like a bomb. It would include how soap was rendered from human fat and human skin with tattoos used to bind folders. Details matter. Statistics numb. Thousands dead becomes real when you see tanned human skin around a paperweight. On November 30th, Hess's defense moved to have him declared insane. Hess, Hitler's erstwhile deputy, had famously flown to England early in the war, seeking to forge an anti-Bolshevik pact with British aristocrats. Arrested, he claimed at first Hitler had sent him. Later, it was his own initiative. In Germany, propaganda claimed he'd gone mad. His name was cut from public lists. In court, he sat glassy-eyed, claimed amnesia, recognized nobody. The medical commission judged him sane enough to stand trial. He would later demand to defend himself. Early December, Göring gave a detailed interview to Neue Zeitung, reprinted by the New York Times. From that moment, the press was barred from speaking with defendants. The Soviets argued rightly that Göring was turning the trial into a personal PR show. He dazzled journalists and dominated co-defendants. He would soon be isolated at mealtimes to prevent collusion. On December 8th, a Soviet soldier, Bubin, waiting in a car outside the Grand Hotel for his superior, was shot in the head by an assailant in civilian clothes, perhaps even in an American uniform. The target was likely Mikhail Likhatchev, NKVD MGB, Bubin's superior. The probable purpose: to sow discord among the Allies. Shortly after, Soviet pilots were arrested for landing without clearance in the U.S. zone, a murky incident. Prosecutor Rudenko protested. They were freed. But tensions rose. On December 11th, the film The Nazi Plan, compiled from German newsreels, was shown, demonstrating that aggression had been deliberate, planned. Around the same time, exhibits from Buchenwald chilled the court. Lampshades made from human tattooed skin was especially prized. On the desk of Commandant Koch a paperweight, made from a shrunken human head. In the American zone, 36 Dachau guards had already been sentenced to death and executed. Koch's wife, Ilse, got life. She died in 1967. She adored trophies made of human skin, especially tattooed. Survivors recounted the perverse sadism of the Buchenwald leadership, truly deranged individuals given absolute power over defenseless inmates. Note: Nuremberg was not the only trial. There were subsequent Nuremberg trials in the American zone, scores of them, against judges, doctors, Einsatzgruppen commanders, camp personnel. Late December, organizations were indicted as criminal: SS, Gestapo, NSDAP, the German government. Martin Bormann was indicted in absentia. He had been seen last during the Battle of Berlin, attempting to break out on a tank, an explosion, then nothing. Years later, 2 bodies were found in Berlin. One was Bormann, identified by remnants of a cyanide ampule in his jaw. Heinrich Müller, the feared Gestapo chief, was never found. The court recessed and reconvened in January. On January 3rd, the testimony of Otto Ohlendorf, Einsatzgruppe D commander, electrified the hall. Meticulous reports of mass executions in the occupied USSR Belarus, Ukraine. How partisans were hunted, civilians shot, whole communities erased. Much of this reached the Western public for the first time. The impact was seismic. On January 8th, Mein Kampf was introduced into evidence, a crucial moment that set the stage for the later blanket ban on Nazi symbols, propaganda, and culture. On January 14th, Admiral Raeder was questioned. He was charged, among other things, with ordering no aid be given to survivors of torpedoed ships. Do not surface to rescue. Preserve the submarine. This became an element of inhumane conduct of war. On January 17th, the French prosecutor de Menthon spoke of France's looting of 1 million bottles of champagne seized. There was indeed a special Reich official for wine who toured the cellars of Bordeaux and Burgundy to arrange shipments to Germany. On January 19th, Fritz Sauckel, who had not expected severe charges after all, he was just the labor czar, faced documents bearing his signature, explicit directives demanding maximum use of slave labor at minimal cost. He protested. "We paid wages." The papers showed the reality. Pennies for some, nothing for many. Coercion, deportations, punishments for managers who failed to meet quotas. The engineer of manpower became a prime mover of mass enslavement. On January 30th, Rudolf Hess demanded to dismiss his lawyer and defend himself after months of catatonia, a sudden awakening. Evidence against Speer followed. He was genuinely talented as a monumental architect, the man behind the Roman pomp of Nazi architecture and the 1936 Olympic Stadium in Berlin, and the grand redesign of the capital. His ascent, in 1937 at the Paris Exposition, the Soviet pavilion featured worker and kolkhoz woman striding forward. It seemed to be crushing the German pavilion. Speer rebuilt the German pavilion as a massive bastion crowned with an eagle gripping the swastika, visually resisting the Soviet colossus. In his defense, Speer argued that 80 million Germans had become victims of a totalitarian propaganda machine radio, newspapers, pre-movie newsreels, poisoning minds daily. "We could not resist. We were poisoned," he said. On February 8th, Roman Rudenko, the Soviet chief prosecutor, delivered a devastating address, one of the trial's most powerful. He would go on to become the USSR's prosecutor general, outlasting even Khrushchev's ire, and die in office in 1981. Rudenko would also be the one to pin Göring down in cross-examination documents, proving Göring's knowledge of racial purges, camps, expropriations, the art collections looted under his patronage. Rudenko declared that all German military testimony, claiming that the invasion of the USSR had not been planned in advance, was false. He had the deposition of Field Marshal Paulus, captured at Stalingrad, to prove it. Defense lawyers scoffed. "Paulus is dead," Rudenko said. "He's alive." "Then bring him. Let's hear living testimony, not papers." Legend has it, Rudenko quipped, in oboe, about 27 minutes. But in reality, within 2 days, a plane brought Paulus from Moscow. His testimony smashed the defense. Operation Barbarossa was planned well in advance. Göring and the entire top Wehrmacht leadership, the SS, Gestapo, the finance ministry, they all knew. The plan included the annihilation of Slavic populations and the expansion of living space. Paulus's words paved the way to the gallows for Keitel and Jodl. From then on, Göring realized the noose was tightening. He had earlier joked with Ribbentrop, "Don't worry, you'll be foreign minister again in the new Germany." No more. He was isolated to eat alone, barred from influencing the group. On February 19th, the Soviets screened their documentary on Nazi atrocities in the USSR. Exhibits included bars of soap rendered from human fat, leather bindings made of human skin. Documents traced the origin of the soap idea. The logic was industrial. If people are to be killed, their remains should be utilized. Waste-free production. Horrifyingly literal. Camps became laboratories, freezing experiments on children and women, deliberate infection with plague, endless medical tortures, all meticulously recorded by Germans. February 25th and 27, the Soviet film on crimes against humanity ran. People fainted in the hall. The press disseminated it worldwide. For the first time, the true scale of the machine was visible to the global public. In March, politics intruded. Churchill delivered his Fulton speech, warning that the USSR was drawing Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria into its orbit. The speech opened a chasm between allies. Göring sensed an opportunity. The trial will collapse, he predicted. On March 11th, Jackson, USA, and Rudenko, USSR, discussed topics to be avoided. The Americans dreaded examination of Western financing of the Reich. The Soviets wanted to avoid the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and especially Katyn. The USSR blamed the Germans for the Katyn massacre of Polish officers. Germans presented documents showing the executions predated 1941's Soviet responsibility. Decades later, Russia would acknowledge Soviet guilt. Back then, both sides tried to steer around these landmines. Still, in cross-examining Ribbentrop, Soviet examiner Zaraya asked questions that let the text of the pact spill out. Soon after, Zaraya was found dead, a suicide while cleaning his pistol. In the late 1980s, his daughter, or granddaughter, accessed archives. Wrong pistol, wrong cartridge. Too much blood for suicide. Likely an execution. The order: do not let the pact or Katyn appear. Ribbentrop, however, recited the pact nearly from memory, and Zaraya paid the price. Mid-March, Erhard Milch, deputy in the Luftwaffe, testified for Göring, a fascinating figure. He had partial Jewish ancestry. In a regime that excluded anyone with Jewish blood from top posts, Milch rose high. Göring had fixed his papers by forcing Milch's mother to sign a statement that Erhard was not her husband's son, but the child of a German aristocrat. With Milch, we behaved disgracefully, Göring joked later, but at least we chose a decent father for him. When Streicher later reignited the affair in 1944 and slandered Göring's wife, claiming the Göring child was conceived in a test tube, which was un-Aryan, Göring retaliated by exposing Streicher's financial crimes. Soon, Streicher was removed for looting Jewish art, offshore accounts, etc. Milch, when captured, reportedly brandished his marshal's baton at American soldiers. He came to court to say, "Göring defended me, a half-Jew. Therefore, how can he be a chief anti-Semite?" The baton, incidentally, was returned to him years later. On April 15th, Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, often confused in Russian memory with Hess, testified. He described gas chambers and crematoria industrialized for mass extermination. His testimony would later be used in the trial of IG Farben owners, of brands you know, Bayer, BASF, etc., which supplied Zyklon B to the camps. The logic was chillingly industrial. Execution by bullet was inefficient. A gas that could kill en masse on schedule was required. Industry obliged. In March, Karl Haushofer, the geopolitician behind Lebensraum, committed suicide. He had articulated the ideological basis for conquering Slav lands and expanding to the Urals. In April, Göring endured a long cross-examination. Rudenko pinned him. Translators like Tatiana Stupnikova recalled Göring could be gallant. "Madame, you fall into reliable hands," he said, catching her when she stumbled. Simultaneous interpretation was an enormous strain. Every word, every objection had to be carried across languages in real time. It was a Herculean job. On April 3rd, the diary of Anne Frank was introduced, a poignant exhibit from occupied Holland. On April 15th, Rosenberg spoke, pouring out mystical nonsense about Aryan destiny, runes, Vikings, Tibet, crusades against Bolsheviks and Jews, and even against the Catholic Church. Göring whispered, "How did Hitler ever bring this man close to him?" On April 29th, Julius Streicher was questioned. He was so vile that even Nazis didn't want to sit near him. Drunk, drugged, and likely a pedophile, he had already once faced charges for indecency with minors before the war. In court, he ranted, "This is Purimfest." He would later cry on the scaffold. In May, Walter Funk, the Reich's finance chief, faced documents on Max Heiliger, a fictitious name used for bank accounts receiving confiscated Jewish wealth, cash, assets, proceeds of forced sales. Funk tried to blame the SS, but his signature co-signing with Himmler to streamline the process sealed his fate. In May, the tribunal issued a decision banning Nazi culture and symbolism. Because, let's be honest, the aesthetics were dangerously seductive. Hugo Boss uniforms, torches, banners, eagles, swastikas, perfectly choreographed marches. To this day, neo-Nazi movements flourish in multiple countries. Nuremberg's ban was necessary. Elsewhere, trials continued. In May, 49 staff of the Mauthausen camp were executed. On May 17th, Romanian dictator Ion Antonescu was executed. Unrepentant, he called himself a loyal ally of Hitler. In Prague, the hangman of Czechoslovakia, Hans Frank, was executed. On May 26th, a Soviet prosecutor named Zoraya, the same, was found dead. As noted, later evidence points to murder, likely over his handling of the Ribbentrop Pact issue. On May 24th, Baldur von Schirach was questioned. He detailed the propagandistic machinery for indoctrinating children from school age. Parades, drums, flags, swastikas, immersing youth in ideology. On June 28th, Rudenko interrogated Hans Fritzsche, the radio voice of Nazi Germany. Here, the mythology that no propagandist escaped punishment falters. Fritzsche would not be sentenced at Nuremberg. He later became a voice actor in the new FRG. Many media figures received minimal sentences or were amnestied. Max Amann, head of the Reich Press Chamber, died in 1957. Otto Dietrich Reich, press chief, died in 1952. Alfred Hugenberg's Media Trust, another giant, carried on. He died in 1951. Das Schwarze Korps, the SS Weekly, had its editor, Günther Dalken, live until 1998. Werner Naumann, state secretary in the propaganda ministry, died peacefully in 1982. Only Der Stürmer's Julius Streicher was hanged. Völkischer Beobachter's editor Wilhelm Weiss got 3 years and died in 1950. As for culture, Leni Riefenstahl, the undeniably brilliant director of Triumph of the Will and Olympia, lived a long, illustrious life, later publishing stunning photography, Africa, pioneering underwater cinematography, and dying in 2003. She was labeled a fellow traveler, but faced no severe penalties. The director of the viciously anti-Semitic film, Jew Seuss, Veit Harlan, continued to work and died in Capri in 1964. Carl Ritter, producer of many propaganda films, died in 1977. In short, quite a few propagandists and cultural figures escaped heavy punishment. There was also amnesty for many. Field Marshal Manstein, a brilliant strategist, faced charges, but evidence was thin on direct atrocities. Soldiers praised him as a decent commander, not a sadist. He later worked with the Bundeswehr. Why so many were freed in the mid-1950s? The Cold War. The Western Bloc looked east and saw the Soviet camp expanding. Skilled officers, engineers, administrators, useful assets. Terms were reduced. People were released and folded into West Germany's military, industrial, and governmental apparatus. The Krupps returned to industry. In America, Operation Paperclip brought over scientists like Werner von Braun, the genius behind the V2, weapon of vengeance. He had overseen facilities using slave labor. Could he not have known? Unlikely. Yet he built NASA's rocket program. Journalists protested. The answer was, we need the brains. The Soviets did the same, bringing their share east. All summer, prosecution and defense made their cases. The defendants were granted final statements. Some requested new psychiatric evaluations. The court refused. The press's interest waned. The trial was long. But then came the climax. Sentences. From September 30th to October 1946, the tribunal read the verdicts. The final Soviet address, Rudenko's, became a classic of international criminal prosecution. Sentences: death by hanging. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall, second man in the Reich. Martin Bormann, in absentia, head of the party chancellery, Reichsleiter. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, here rendered Brunner in some retellings, head of the RSHA, and tellingly, president of Interpol through the war. Joachim von Ribbentrop, Reich Foreign Minister. Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the High Command. Alfred Rosenberg, the ideologue. Hans Frank, Governor-General of occupied Poland. Wilhelm Frick, Reichsleiter and Interior Minister. Julius Streicher, the Rabbitstürmer. Fritz Sauckel, Slave Labor Gar. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, Austria, Netherlands. Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations. Life imprisonment. Rudolf Hess, Walter Funk, Erich Raeder, Commander of the Navy. In the 1960s, Funk and Raeder would be released early. Hess would die in Spandau much later by suicide in extreme old age. 20 years. Baldur von Schirach, Albert Speer, who would write best-selling memoirs after release. 15 years. Konstantin von Neurath. 10 years. Karl Dönitz. Acquitted. Franz von Papen, diplomat, helped Hitler to power. Hjalmar Schacht, former Reichsbank chief minister without portfolio, insufficient evidence of his direct role in plunder. Hans Fritzsche, the radio voice, to the outrage of many. The executions took place on October 16th. There were scenes of humiliation. Streicher soiled himself and shouted, "Purim Fest!" But one man escaped the rope. On October 15th, Hermann Göring bit into a cyanide ampoule. How did it reach him? Perhaps bribed American guards at the behest of his wife. Perhaps he'd hidden it in the cell, some say under the toilet rim. Speer would later claim he too had a cyanide capsule in a tube of toothpaste, but chose not to use it. Beyond Nuremberg, the main trial was followed by many. Doctors, judges, industrialists, Einsatzgruppen. Denazification processes were required for ordinary Germans to resume public life. Even recently, elderly ex-guards have been wheeled into court in Germany. Israel pursued war criminals worldwide, famously capturing Eichmann in Argentina and trying him in Jerusalem. The meaning of Nuremberg became a new epoch in international law. The scale of the work was staggering. In less than a year, 403 sessions, 216 days of hearings, 240 witnesses, 300,000 written statements, 16,000 pages of transcript. Stalin did not decorate his prosecutors. He thought the trial insufficiently thorough. Too many escaped punishment, especially propagandists like Hans Fritzsche, who had called Slavs subhumans. Still, Nuremberg taught the world that aggressors must be held to account. It created the template for later instruments: the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 1950 European Convention on Human Rights, the 1966 Human Rights Covenants, the 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property. Later, tribunals on Yugoslavia, on Rwanda, followed Nuremberg's blueprint. Beyond the unspeakable crimes, the word genocide came into general use at Nuremberg. Another truth emerged. The Third Reich ran on lies. Lies to citizens, lies to each other, lies at every level. We didn't know. We followed orders. Ernest Hemingway put it best: fascism is a lie told by bullies. And Erich Maria Remarque wrote of Hitler. In him, there was a concentration of such quantities of baseness, indifference, egotism, stupidity, incompetence, mawkish sentimentality, amateurism, and cowardice that it would suffice to demolish any myth of a Führer or of a master race. That is what Nuremberg revealed. Thank you for watching. All the best. Goodbye.